Quotation marks is a very important punctuation symbol. You use quotation marks to indicate that a statement made to another person is being quoted word for word. It seems simple, but sometimes using quotation marks can be confusing, and it's important to learn the correct ways to use them. You use quotation marks to signal direct quotation. Let's look at our examples here. The crowd chanted, "Yes, we can," as they waited for the speech to begin. What the crowd said was, "Yes, we can," so to quote it directly, we put quotation marks around it. Let's look at our second example. She smiled and said, "Son, this is one incident that I will never forget." This is a quote. It's the exact words that this speaker said, so quotation marks go around her words. You use quotation marks to enclose the words of each speaker within running dialogue. Running dialogue means there's more than one speaker and it's shifting back and forth. You mark each shift in speaker with a new paragraph. So let's look at this example from Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility. "I want no proof of their affection," said Eleanor, "but of their engagement I do." We switch speakers, have a new paragraph, new quotation marks. "I am perfectly satisfied of both." We switch speakers back again, yet not a syllable has been said to you on the subject by either of them. So we're switching back and forth. Each speaker's words are within quotation marks. You use single quotation marks when you have a quote within a quote. Let's look at the example. Baldwin says, "The title, 'The Uses of the Blues,' does not refer to music. I don't know anything about music." So here we have a quote by this Baldwin person, but he also uses a title inside the quotation. So single quotation marks go inside the double quotation marks. If you're going to have a very long quote in your paper, and most high school papers won't have this, but college papers often do, you're going to set the quotation off by starting it on a new line and indenting it from the left margin. The format known as block quotation does not require quotation marks. So the long part of the story that you're quoting, you don't have to put in quotation marks. Look at the example here. It says in suspended, Joy Harrow tells of her first awareness of jazz as a child. Then it goes into what she says. The long part of what she says does not have to have quotation marks, but it is set apart in what's called block quotation. Quoting poetry can be difficult for some people. If you're going to quote more than 3 lines, indent the block 1 inch from the left margin and don't use quotation marks. You need to be careful to follow the spacing, capitalization, punctuation, and other features of the original poem. Poetry, it matters what words are capitalized, how it's punctuated, how it's spaced, and it's important to reproduce that exactly. Let's look at the example here. The Duke in Robert Browning's poem, My Last Duchess, is clearly a jealous, vain person whose arrogance is illustrated through this statement. Then you see the poem, and you see the lines. It's lines 31 through 34, and it's written out just exactly the way it would be in the poem, and no quotation marks are used because it's a long quote. If you're quoting using quotation marks to enclose the titles of short poems, short stories, articles, essays, sections of books, and episodes of TV and radio programs. Look at the example. The essay, Big and Bad, analyzes some reasons for the popularity of SUVs. You also use quotation marks to enclose definitions. Look at the example. In social science, the term sample size means the number of individuals being studied in a research project. So the definition of sample size goes in quotation marks. If you're using other punctuation, it's important to know where to put the quotation marks. Periods and commas go inside closing quotation marks. Look at this quote by Janis Joplin. "Don't compromise yourself," said Janis Joplin. "You are all you've got." If you look at the first part, there's a comma after yourself, and it's inside the quotation marks. At the end, we've got a period after got, it's also inside with the quotation marks. If you have colons, semicolons, and footnote numbers, those go outside the closing quotation marks. And you can see how this looks in the examples. I felt one emotion after finishing Eveline, sorrow. Tragedy is defined by Aristotle as an invitation of an action that is serious and of a certain magnitude. You can see the little one for the footnote that goes outside the quotation marks. Question marks, exclamation points, and dashes go inside the quotations if they are part of the quoted material. For example, if the cashier asks, "Would you like to supersize that?" We're quoting what the cashier said, so the question mark goes inside the quotation mark. Question marks, exclamation points, and dashes go outside the quotation marks if they are not part of the quoted material. In our example here, what is the theme of the birthmark? The birthmark is the quoted material. It's a title. The question is not a part of that, so it goes outside of the quotation marks. A lot of people misuse quotation marks. For example, you don't use quotation marks for indirect quotations. Indirect quotations are something that does not use someone's exact words. So some people might write, "Mother smiled and said that she, quote, she was sure she would never forget the incident," end quote. It should be, "Mother smiled and said that she was sure she would never forget the incident." We're not quoting Mother, we're only reporting that she said something. You don't use quotation marks just to add emphasis, and a lot of people do this with air quotation marks. For example, we wouldn't say the hikers were startled by the appearance of a gigantic grizzly bear and put gigantic in quotation marks. We would just leave it out. Another way people misuse quotation marks is to put it around slang or colloquial language. If you do that, it gives the impression that you're being apologetic about using those words, like you didn't know any better words, or people who use those words are somehow uneducated or unsophisticated. For example, after our 20-mile hike, we were completely exhausted and ready to turn in. Turn in is a relatively common phrase. There's no need to use quotation marks around it. Quotation marks. Important little marks, and it's important to know how to use them correctly so that people understand what you have to say when you're writing.